Welcome to Module 7. My name is Barbara Mannweiler and I'm a project manager at the Institute of Translational Research. Today we will talk about integrating clinical trials into the clinical routine, conducting clinical trials. So for start, when we think about conducting clinical trials, the most important part of the conduct is actually the subject. So you need persons involved in your trial so that you can actually conduct it. And to get a better insight in how you can include persons into your study, let us see first what a subject actually is. As per the ICH-GCP definition, a trial subject is an individual who participates in a clinical trial, either as a recipient of the investigational product or as a control. So basically, whomever you include in your trial is a trial subject. But how can you actually get them? How can you get from the general population to the actual enrolled trial subject? So in the following slides, we will go through the different stages. And starting with the general population, we will first have a look at how you can identify potential trial subjects so that anyone from the general population who is interested into taking part in the trial can be identified. There are different methods for promoting trial participation. For example, you can talk to the person sitting right in front of you. For example, when you are anyways treating a person, so you can just explain to them that there is a study that might be of interest for them. Of course, there can also be advertisements on, for example, institutional websites. You can provide leaflets, posters, or flyers to persons. There can be press releases or advertisements in newspapers. You can publish it on social media or use patient or volunteer registries. So there are a lot of different ways how you can approach persons and ask for their interest in participating in a specific trial. However, it is most important that you remember that all the information material or advertisements that is subject facing, so everything you give like directly to a person to advertise your study, has to be previously approved by the ethics committees. So there may be different regulations depending on the country you're working in, but usually everything that's patient-facing has to be approved prior to its use. So always make sure that whatever you want to use for advertisement or information material, have it approved previously. And to give you another example for the last point here, which may be a bit more abstract than just having advertisement material, this is the volunteer or patient registries. And therefore, I would like to present to you a registry of ours, which is the Accelerate Volunteer Registry that was established in 2021. And this used to just have people register, which is in this case happening in over 25 countries. And we provide all the information in 22 languages so that everyone can be approached in their native language so that they actually understand what this registry is about. And up to today, we have over 100,000 volunteers registered in the registry, with over 1,300 people enrolled in vaccine trials and over 7,000 people enrolled in diagnostic studies. So how such a volunteer registry works is that in the first place, we have individuals that are generally interested in vaccine trials. So everyone that gets aware that there's a registry and gets access to a database and can register via online questionnaire into this database, so that we get a pool of people that are generally interested in participating in a trial. In this case, it is about vaccine trials, but it could be about any trial that you want to perform. And on the other hand, we have entities that do want to conduct a trial, and they can request for volunteers in this database. So based on the specifics of the study, this database is filtered for in an exclusion criteria, for example, so that we get information about the pool of volunteers that is interested in this particular trial and could also match as a potential trial subject. And those people can then actively contact the trial sites or the sponsor and ask for inclusion or screening for inclusion into this trial. So it's a very convenient way to get access to people that are anyways interested in participating in a trial, and depending on the registry, that also directly fall in your research area, for example. So you should always keep in mind that besides direct approaches and advertisements, it may be useful also in your case to use a registry such as the Accelerate Volunteer Registry for your trial. So we have now identified the potential trial subjects, and now comes a very important part where you have to be very careful in the preparation and conduct, which is the informed consent procedure. And in this part of the trial conduct, you actually want to explain everything that's happening to the person and get them to agree to participate in your trial. So the informed consent per ICH-GCP definition is a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a trial after having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. This informed consent is then documented by means of a written, signed, and dated informed consent form. It is important to understand that this whole process is made up of different things. So on the one hand, you have an information sheet, and on the other hand, a consent form. So you have to provide all the information to a patient that they need to understand what will happen to them if they enter the trial. And in the second part, if everything is understood and all the questions are clarified, then it has to be documented that an informed consent with all the information available has been given by the subject to be included in the trial. So on the first, so going in more detail for the first part, which is the information part of this whole informed consent document. This is made up of basically everything there is to know for the potential subject. So of course, you will start with some contact details and emergency contact details, that the participation in this trial is always voluntary. In the patient information sheet, the whole trial should be described. So there should be a summary, how the trial is designed, how long it will take, how many people will be included, how many visits there will be with the different examinations, how long all this will take for the individual subject and for the overall trial. A very important part of this document is a risk-benefit analysis. So it should be very clearly explained what possible benefits there are for a subject, but also what risks there are, especially if an IMP is taken, or also for different interventions like blood draws or CT scans or whatever there could be done during the trial. So this all has to be explained in detail to the future subject. The reasons for exclusion should be described, as well as reimbursements or compensations for study subjects in case they are paid. But also, if not, this has to be stated in the document. Additionally, the information about insurance should be stated. So if there is an insurance, what insurance will be provided with respective details. The subject needs to know what will happen in case new scientific findings get available, how early withdrawal will be done, either from subject, investigator, or sponsor perspective, how data will be collected and processed. So data protection plays a crucial role in this document and has to be explained very thoroughly. In case you will be working with biomaterials in your trial, also the taking of biomaterials, storage, and processing of them has to be explained. And after all that comes the declaration of consent. So this information in consent document can be quite extensive because you have to cover a lot of information. And it's always useful and recommended to just reach out to persons who have experience in writing such a document. However, there are also certain tools that can help you create such an informed consent document, like, for example, the ETIC, the electronic tool for informed consent documents, which is a tool for compiling ICFs and has been established by the Technical University of Munich. And for this tool, you just enter the specifics for your study into this online tool, and it gives you back a proposed text and wording for an ICF that you can then work with further. So once you have this document with all the information and the consent pages in the end, this is the document that you actually give to your patient or your subject if you want to talk about the possibility to include them. And that means you don't just give them this document, but you go through it. So this should always be an investigator-subject discussion, conversation. So it's not just giving the document and letting them read it, but you should talk about it. So explain to them all the aspects that we just went through in an understandable language, while not coercing or influencing them to participate, just giving them plainly the details. Additionally, all the information that may be requested by the subject, so additional questions or concerns or doubts or whatever, should be discussed. And if additional questions are raised, those should be noted down on the document or on the actual document pages so that you can confirm that you have talked about them. And after this conversation, you should always give subjects enough time to reflect on what you talked about so that they can actually decide whether they want to participate or not. In case you are working with your patients, always make sure that this process, that having spoken to them about a possible enrollment in a study and the informed consent procedure, is written down, for example, with date and time in the patient's medical record. Because once this patient is enrolled, this will be checked by the monitors. So if you have such an informed consent discussion and include a patient, always make sure to put it also in the patient medical record. And if finally your subject decides they want to be included in the study, they want to give their informed consent, then first the subject and then the investigator will personally acknowledge the ICF with handwritten date and signature. As you can see here, there's room for some additional questions, and then first the subject and then the investigator will provide their name, the date, and their signature. And sometimes it's also requested to note down the time, which is like, again, usually dependent on your study design and the actual protocol specifics, but this may be needed to prove that the subject has signed as the first person. And when you come to the signature part, always double check and make sure that you are working with the correct ICF version, because it can be changed over the course of a trial. So always make sure that you're working with the most recent version and that all the details are provided correctly. So handwritten name, date, time, and signature of everyone that has to provide this information. As you can maybe imagine, there are also other circumstances where we need to adapt this process. For example, if people cannot read or write or have a legal representative or are, for example, unconscious at the time of inclusion as per study protocol. So for all these instances, there are specific rules that apply, which we will not go into at this point here, but know that there are further scenarios where this process has to be adapted. But also there are a lot of rules, a lot of regulations that you have to consider. So always very thoroughly plan your informed consent procedure when you set up your actual clinical trial. So now we have gathered the informed consent of our potential study subjects. That means we can now go on with the screening for the actual trial and the enrollment of the subjects that you can see here. And the very important first thing I want to mention when talking about screening is that you, under no circumstances, are allowed to do any trial-related activity, so no screening, no examinations, and no data processing before you receive the informed consent from your subject. So whatever you need to do to check for eligibility, you always need to have the informed consent first. And then you can go on and do the screening, check for the in and exclusion criteria, do all the examinations that are needed for that. And once you have all the results, the investigator or a delegated member of the study group can decide whether the potential subject should be enrolled in the study or not. And this decision and all the details about the study subject should be documented in the screening and enrollment log. This log contains information related to the initial evaluation of potential subjects, such as the screening date and whether the subject is enrolled. It can look like this, where you have some trial details on the top of the document, and then there comes a list of all the subjects that have gone through the screening process. So you see the date of consent, the subject ID that has been given to that person, the start date of screening or the actual screening date, depending on how long the screening actually takes, the outcome of that screening. So could this person be enrolled or not? If they were not enrolled, why were they not enrolled? And when did the enrollment happen? And another very important log when talking about subject enrollment is the subject identification log, which is a confidential record that links a subject's unique identification code or a number within the study to their personal identifiable information. Because as you have seen previously, we just see a subject ID, no name, no birth dates, no personal information, just a subject ID. And to know what person stands behind the subject ID, you need this identification log. Because here, the actual name of a person and their birth date get connected to the subject ID. And this is a highly confidential document. It should never be shared with a sponsor. And this is actually the key that allows you to have information about what person is actually standing behind this artificial subject ID. And this brings us to a very commonly mixed up phrasing of pseudonymization and anonymization. Because in the first case, you have the personal information, just as we have just seen, and you give it, or you attach to this personal information an arbitrary number, like in this case, the subject ID. And with the subject identification log, you have a key to again identify the person that's behind the subject ID. Whereas when you anonymize data, generally, it means that you do it in a one-way street way. So you have the personal information and you exchange this information with anonymized data. So you just provided a number or give it a number, but it's irreversible. So once data are anonymized, you do not have a key, such a list, to go back to the personal information. So always make sure, because this is very often mixed up in terms of clinical trials, what you're talking about. If you actually can reverse what you have done, like in this case, or if you do actually have anonymized data. As I said, most of these documents are anyways highly confidential, and anyways, the signed ICFs, the screening log, the subject identification log should always be very thoroughly maintained and then kept in the ISF. So now that you have enrolled patient, you have checked for eligibility, included them, and have gone through all the logs with them, you have a lot of to-dos afterwards, of course, because now the actual study conduct with this subject can begin. So the first thing you do is provide all the needed documents to the subject, which is the signed ICF and insurance conditions, the subject participation card, for example, or a subject diary that has to be filled, questionnaires they should fill at home. Then you should go on and inform the cooperating departments, and if applicable, the ward, that there is a new patient that will need some time slots in the near future. The subject should be registered in the case report form, and if it is a randomized study, the randomization should be done. And of course, the trial visit should actually be scheduled and prepared. But let us now have a look at what this trial planning and preparation actually entails. So you need to get an idea about who's in charge and what do they need to do, what do we need to prepare for the actual trial, and when will these visits actually be done. So first thing first is to coordinate appointments with all the parties that are involved. So you need to coordinate the appointment, of course, with the subject because they need to come to the site for their visit, most probably. It has to be coordinated with the study team, with the ward or outpatient department, the laboratory, and probably also other departments, for example, the radiology in case of a need for a time slot for a CT scan or else. What you always have to remember when coordinating is that the assigned task can only be assigned to members of the study team that have the appropriate roles defined in the delegation log. So we will not have a closer look at the delegation log in this course, but you do need to remember this in all the stages of trial conduct, that whatever task is assigned to someone, this person has to be properly assigned in the delegation log to actually perform these tasks. So always make sure that, especially if other parties are involved, that proper delegation has been done previously. Another important point that you have to consider once you know that your subject will come to a trial visit, you have made aware the radiology laboratory knows that a new blood sample will come in. You also have to think about the handling and distribution of the IMP. And the responsibility for the IMP accountability at the trial site is always with you as the investigator. It is possible to assign some or all of those duties to, for example, an appropriate pharmacist or other appropriate individuals under the supervision of the investigator, but ultimately the responsibility for the IMP at site always is with the investigator. So this is a really important topic that we will go through now, and there's a lot to consider when working with IMPs. So as a first step, as you can imagine, the IMP has to be ordered. And in doing so, you should consider the shipment procedure, expiration dates, so how much IMP is actually reasonable to order, how is blinding done, what are the logistics, what can you actually store at your site? So always think about all these things and order and reorder your IMP timely, depending on all these issues here. After you ordering the IMP, it will be delivered to you, and upon arrival, it should, of course, immediately be processed. So you should check for the correctness, completeness of the IMP. Is the expiration date correct? Is it correctly labeled? Is it necessary to do some relabeling? And of course, you have to document the receipt of the IMP. And once you have it in hand, it needs to be stored. And this should always be in compliance with the study protocol. So you will always get information about what you have to do with the IMP, how it should be stored, where it is allowed to be stored. So just stick to whatever is mentioned in the protocol and make sure that the IMP at your site can only be accessed by authorized trial staff. So now that you have the IMP in place at your site, you are ready to administer it. And in order to do so, you have to consider whether your trial is randomized or not. We briefly mentioned randomization a few slides prior. So Again, randomization is the process of assigning trial subjects to treatment or control groups using an element of chance to determine the assignments in order to reduce bias. So actually, it's just like flipping a coin where it's decided what a patient receives. So is it the IMP? Is it a placebo? Is it a controlled standard of care treatment? So this is depending on the trial design, but it's the element of chance that decides here. There are different possibilities how randomization can be done. Usually this is done by an interactive voice or web response system. And you just enter the subject details and get an information out what they should receive. And once you know about the allocation, you can administer the IMP in accordance with the study protocol. So it is of utmost importance that you make sure that the IMP is only administered to subject of that specific trial and not to any other subject. And it needs to be documented in the CRF. Furthermore, you have to double check for correctness before administration. So you need to make sure that when you administer the IMP, it is the correct trial arm, correct subject, correct IMP, and it's not expired. The IMP has to be exclusively used in the corresponding trial, regardless of whether it has a marketing authorization or not. So even though you may be in a phase 4 with a marketed drug, it is important that you make sure that all these things are checked and that the actual IMP as intended is given to the patient for this trial, although it can be maybe even just be bought over the counter. That doesn't matter. If we are in a trial, we have trial medication and trial subject, and we definitely need to stick to that allocation. After administration, you may have empty containers, or there may be leftovers, expired medication. It is important that you keep all this stuff for the monitoring visits, because the monitor will go through everything you have at site and do their own accountability and make sure that every IMP, every unit has been tracked properly. That means also that you have to inform and remind your subjects that in the case that they take IMP at home, that they are required to bring all the packages, all the leftover, for example, tablets, back to your site in case of self-administration so that it can be properly tracked as well. So this brings us very directly to the actual drug accountability, which is what I just mentioned. So we have to keep track of where every single IMP is going. So you need to have an overview of the IMP stock at trial site. So you audit, you receive, you give out to patient, you receive back from patient, things expire, and you may even send things back to the sponsor. And all this needs to be kept up to date and needs to be documented in a drug accountability. So besides the IMP stock at trial site, you need, as I just mentioned, an overview of IMP distribution, return, destruction, and you need to provide all the information in a log. And it could look like this, where you see, again, some study details at the top of the document, and then you get information about the randomization number or subject ID. So what patient received how many tablets? When did they receive them from you? What lot number or batch number and expiration date did they have? When did they bring it back to you? How many of them did they bring back to you? You have to sign it. You can comment if there's anything important to say. For example, the patient forgot that they are not allowed to throw them away and discharge like 4 tablets into the bin. So this could be commented here. So it's explained why 4 pills are missing. And as I said, the CRA or monitor will check this accountability and also sign this with initials that this has been checked from them. So it's really important, again, I want to emphasize this, that you keep track of all the IMP because it is always your responsibility as the trial site and as the investigator to know what is going on with your drug accountability. And the next thing that we need to consider, of course, are all the samples. So we do not only have the IMP that is going back and forth, we also collect probably samples from the subject. They also need to be stored and shipped. So you need to clarify what will be shipped. Will it be shipped directly? Do you store it up front? Do you analyze centrally or maybe also at your own site? So what will happen to all the samples? And in case it needs to be stored or sent away, you need to prepare the logistics for that. So additionally, the correct storage and also shipment temperatures, humidity, and further characteristics have to be prepared and considered. And the whole shipping has to be organized in terms of, like, for example, IATA certificates that should be in place. So always think about this at the right time so that you can properly organize the shipping of samples. And once you either from your own lab or from a central lab get your lab findings back, those always have to be seen by the PI. So the investigator has to sign off everything they see with either the comment that it's not clinically significant or that it is. So as the lab values may represent some important findings or events that happen in a subject, the NCS, not clinically significant, is very important information that has to be added at on these lab finding documents. And because the clinical evaluation of the investigator is directly done on this document, this is considered source data. So please keep in mind that you have to file it accordingly. And especially this topic of lab values that are maybe out of range and get marked as being significant, this whole topic brings us to the mentioned events that can happen in your trial subject and how important it is to properly deal with such events. So this whole topic of vigilance is very, very important, and you need to be aware of your obligations and responsibilities and to understand what actually counts as an event when you do a clinical trial. So we have started with finding subjects, you have enrolled them, you treat them, you do whatever you planned in your trial during the conduct. But at any given time point, anything could happen regarding pharmacovigilance. So there could always be happening something with a subject that needs your attention. And any event that could happen, we call an adverse event. And this is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product and which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. So an adverse event is any unfavorable and unintended sign, symptom, or disease which is temporarily associated with the use of a medicinal product, whether or not related to the medicinal product. And in simpler terms, it just means no matter whether your patient has a headache or a broken bone, and no matter whether you think or not it has a relation to the IMP, each of these events is considered an adverse event because it is a trial subject, and it happened after having received an IMP. So no matter what happens, we call all these events adverse events. And this includes, for example, late effects of previous therapy, side effects of concomitant medication, symptoms of underlying diseases, laboratory values, as we have just seen, that deviate from normal values. They all count as an adverse event. And usually the study protocol defines the term in detail. and it can also restrict some specific events that do not need to be recorded. For example, deviations from normal values that are expected in the disease, they can be excluded from being documented. So always make sure to check what the protocol says in terms of adverse events. But except from that, always assume that whatever happens is considered an adverse event and needs to be recorded. And for the recording, you need to assess the severity of such an adverse event. And that means to which extent the patient is affected by the adverse event or reaction. And again, you should always refer to the study protocol and adhere to the scale that they use for categorization. But usually the common scale to categorize severity is the common terminology criteria for adverse events, or which is formally known as the CDC. And this is a grading system that goes from grade 1 to 5, with 1 being mild adverse event, which is asymptomatic or with mild symptoms, and no intervention is indicated. While grade 5 is death related to an AE, with the other 3 grades ranging in between. So this is how you rate the severity of an adverse event. And looking back to the whole pool of adverse events, it may happen that you can directly connect such an event to the IMP that has been administered. And then we are talking about adverse reaction or adverse drug reaction. Because at least if it cannot be ruled out, there may be a connection between the event and the IMP. So if we're talking about medication that has not been approved yet, we are talking about adverse drug reactions when we're talking about unintended responses to a medicinal product related to any dose, and where a causal relationship between a medicinal product and an adverse event is at least reasonable possibility. That means the relationship cannot be ruled out. So we do not have just any adverse event where we cannot be sure what happened, or that may even be totally not at all be connected to the IMP. But in this case, there is a reasonable possibility. So out of all the IEs, we name this reaction. And when we are talking about marketed medicinal products, ADR means a response to a drug which is unintended and doses normally used in men, because there, after the approval, we know about the dose that this medicinal product actually has when it's used. So we have all the IEs, no matter if they are connected or not, and we have an adverse drug reaction when there is a possibility that the AE is in direct contact or in direct connection with the IMP. Going a step further, we get to know the term seriousness. And seriousness refers to the clinical cause or outcome of an adverse event or adverse reaction. And seriousness is defined as any untoward medical occurrence that at any dose results in death, or is life-threatening, or requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of an existing hospitalization, or results in persistent or significant disability or incapacity, or is a congenital anomaly or birth defect. So out of all the adverse events that we may have, some of them may be serious. So as these 5 points here indicate, any AE that matches one of these 5 points is considered a serious adverse event. But please remember that severe and serious is not the same, because seriousness is based on the clinical course or outcome and affect the reporting obligation. So as we have just seen, it's life-threatening or requires hospitalization, whereas severity is the grading which is used to assess the intensity of an adverse event. And if we now go another step further, we can look at those cases which are a serious adverse event, so it matches one of the 5 points, and additionally, it is in connection to the actual IMP that has been administered. And this is what we call serious adverse reaction or serious adverse drug reaction. So it is any adverse medical event that has one or more outcomes corresponding to a serious adverse event, so matches one of the 5 points, and for which at least one possible causal relation between the investigational medicinal product and the SAE is assumed. So again, we have any AE that is serious and that is in connection to the IMP. And this is what we then call SADR. Going down the last step in our categorization of adverse events, we come to so-called SUSAs. SUSAs are suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions. So in other terms, we have an adverse event that matches one of the 5 points, so it's considered a serious adverse event, and it cannot be ruled out that it's related to the IMP. So we have a serious adverse reaction. What now makes it a SUSAR and a single category in our list of different AEs is that it's suspected to be unexpected. And the unexpectedness is defined by this reaction not being listed in our reference safety information. So usually we have some reference safety information, or we need to have this reference safety information, which is usually the investigator brochure or the SMPC. And there, all the expected side effects that could happen and all the adverse events are listed. So whatever we expect the IMP to do is listed there. But it becomes dangerous if we don't know about some reaction that we see happening. And whenever we see such an event that has not been listed there and which is serious, it's considered a SUSAR, so a suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction, which requires immediate action to protect other trial subjects. Because it's serious, it's potentially life-threatening or requires hospitalization or matches any of the other 5 characteristics for being an SAE, but we never knew it could happen. So it's very important to protect all the other subjects, and that leads to very specific reporting obligations. And these also exist for other cases, so we will now step by step go through what you have to do if you detect any of those adverse events. Firstly, the adverse events, so everything that could happen, but which are defined as critical in the protocol, must be reported by the investigator to the sponsor within specified time periods. Of course, every adverse event has to be documented and listed, and we will come to that in a few slides. But if it's critical, it has to be proactively reported to the sponsor. The serious adverse events have to be reported immediately by the investigator to the sponsor and should be followed promptly by written reports and follow-up information. So no matter if you have all the information at hand right away, you can just provide your first report within the given timelines to the sponsor and later on provide a follow-up. For adverse drug reactions that are both serious and unexpected, so our SUSAs, the sponsor should expedite the reporting to all investigators once you have made them aware of that. So you have to immediately provide the information to the sponsor in order to ensure patient safety at all sites. And then the sponsor has to expedite the reporting to all investigators. And additionally, you and the sponsor may have requirements to report to the IRB IEC and to the regulatory authorities. So this is not just between you and the sponsor, but in case of SUSARs, this is also to be reported to authorities and ethics. This may also be applicable for serious adverse events. However, the timelines and the form of reporting may differ between different countries and depending on the study design and, of course, the specific regulations. So you should always be very aware of what you're dealing with and that there can be like only hours and days of timeline that you have for reporting certain events. Generally, all adverse events and serious adverse events, of course, must be documented in an accurate, legible, complete, and timely way because timing is crucial for the risk-based management system. And as we've just said, it's all about patient safety and sometimes also just about reporting obligations to further regulatory authorities. So it's always important to do your reporting on time because otherwise there can be quite drastic consequences. And if you don't follow the rules, so to say, this will always lead to findings. So please always take care that you know about your timelines and know what to do and how to do it. All the AEs and SAEs have to be assessed. So as we've discussed, is there a causal relation to the investigation of medicinal product? Those reports must be stored in compliance with GCP and the study protocol. And where does this actually has to be done and how or where does this need to be documented? So every adverse event that happens has to go into the patient file, of course, just because it has happened, of course. You have to include it in the electronic case report form or ECRF. And as I just mentioned, there are specific documentation forms for adverse events and also for SAE and also for SUSA reporting. There are specialized forms that need to be used in order to report to regulatory or to the sponsor. But do not be afraid of pharmacovigilance. It is important and it is complex, but in any way, you will find the information in the study protocol, also in the AB or the SMPC as reference safety information, or in a safety handling plan. So you will be provided, or you have to provide in case this is your study, the exact time periods in which reports must be made, additional events that need to be reported, for example, adverse events that are of special interest are defined as critical AE. On the other hand, events that do not especially need to be reported, how follow-up of SAEs will be handled, and further study-specific regulations that may apply for the specific study. So this will be very well thought out, and it should be done quite in advance of the actual trial conduct. But also during conduct, there will always be a source of all the information you need because this is really important and really directly influences patient safety. One last point that I want to go through when talking about the reporting obligations is what do you actually need to do when you are working in a blinded trial? Because we have talked now a lot about the connection between the IMP and an adverse event, but in a blinded trial, you do not actually know whether a patient received the IMP or not. So there are special procedures for clinical trials with blinded investigational products. Firstly, the serious adverse event should be reported by the investigator to the sponsor just the same way as for unblinded clinical trials. If the serious adverse event assessment by the sponsor, assuming that the study participant has received the study drug, results in a SUSAR, the sponsor must unblind the case for reporting because we cannot report in a blind way. So unblinding during the course of the trial should only be undertaken by the investigator if this is relevant to the safety of the trial subject. That means emergency unblinding can be done by the investigator if it is absolutely necessary. So the result of unblinding has immediate consequences for the future treatment of the subject, of course. So if you're in an emergency situation and you immediately need to know what this person received in order to treat them properly, probably just rescue them, you need to unblind And of course, this has immediate consequences. The process you need to go through in order to unblind a person mainly depends on how the blinding has been done. So was it done online? Do you need emergency envelopes? But this all has to be planned quite in advance. So when you're planning an unblinded trial, you have to focus very much on the unblinding procedures for emergency cases. You need to document the date, time, and person who has done the unblinding and why unblinding has occurred. And you have to be aware that data of the subject that was unblinded can no longer be used for the efficiency analysis because, of course, the unblinding is no longer there. Unblinding will, as we've just seen, also be done by the sponsor, because if an SAE is classified as a CECAD, it must be unblinded because reporting of blinded cases to the competent authorities is not possible. However, if it is possible, blindness should be maintained for the persons that are analyzing the data, so that at least, yeah, in double-blinded studies, some people remain blinded and only certain parts of the analysis exclude this unblinded person. So to wrap this all up and give you back an overview of what you need to keep in mind, despite all the obligations, all the reporting, and all the specifics, you should take home with you that we have adverse events that happen in a clinical trial no matter what you do. People will break their legs or have a headache, so everything that could occur is an adverse event. And if it cannot be ruled out that there's a connection to the IMP, these adverse events which have a connection are considered adverse drug reaction. And of those adverse events that match one of the 5 criteria that we have seen, they are called serious adverse events. So if they are life-threatening or require hospitalization, they are called serious adverse events. And within those that apply to the SAE and the ADR section, these are the serious adverse drug reaction. So they are serious and they can be brought into connection with the IMP that has been administered. And ultimately, and the most important category regarding your obligations and the criticality for patient safety is a CECAD, which is a serious adverse event with a probable connection to the IMP that has not been previously defined in the IB or SMPC. So this is what you should take home with you for in regards to pharmacovigilance. And with that, I thank you for joining today. And as always, if you have questions or remarks, please contact academy@ucgn.de.